Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the different filing options in Arizona for a divorce process. So, a year or so ago, the Maricopa County court system introduced this concept called the summary consent decree. And it was actually adopted by the state legislature this past August 2022. So, what is really kind of the difference in your two options for filing for divorce now? So let's start with the traditional option so you know what to compare it to. So traditionally, when you're going through a divorce, one spouse will file what's called a petition or an initial filing. That initial filing is what you classically think of when someone says they filed for divorce. That's what a petition is. And it depends on what process you're in. If you're in litigation, that petition is going to be very adversarial. So it's going to say what you want and your demands in terms of your assets, your debts, parenting plans, support, etc. If you're in a more neutral process like mediation, your petition is going to be more neutral, not have demands, just say that you're going to work out those issues in mediation. Once the petition is filed, the court wants to make sure that your spouse knows that you're going through the divorce process. So they have you do service on your spouse. That could look like, again, in litigation, more adversarial, like a process server or sheriff delivering it to your spouse's home or office. Or in mediation, a more collaborative process with the signing of an acceptance of service. It's basically a receipt saying that they have received the documents, the petition, and understand that you filed for divorce. Once that service is complete, your 60-day waiting period starts. So in Arizona, we have a 60-day waiting period. A lot of states have a waiting period, like California is 6 months. So you have to wait 60 days from service until you can file your final consent decree, which are your final agreements. Now, in between that period, or even past that 60 days, if you've watched my other videos, you know that litigation typically takes you close to a year, so it's going to be much longer than your 60-day waiting period, while mediation is closer to that 60 days, or just a little bit longer. In litigation, because it's an adversarial process, there's going to be a ton of other filings. In mediation, there's probably not going to really be any. But ultimately, you'll finalize your process with what's called a consent decree or a settlement agreement, which covers all your final agreements on the three main issues: division of assets and debts, parenting plan if you have minor children, and support agreements if you need them, like spousal maintenance or child support. That's your traditional process. The summary consent decree process was introduced to simplify that process, particularly for individuals who have come to their agreements already. So a summary consent decree process is basically taking all those steps and mashing them together into one filing. So as we talked about with the traditional process, you have a minimum of 3 filings: petition, acceptance of service, consent decree. With your summary consent decree process, you're putting all those pieces together. So you're signing a petition together instead of one person doing a petition and one person doing an acceptance of service or other service process. And you're both signing your consent decree, which is attached to your petition. Now, the 60-day waiting period start is a bit different. So in that traditional period, we did petition, acceptance of service. 60 days started, then filed the consent decree. If you do this summary consent decree process, you're completing all of your agreements together. So all your final agreements, again, assets and debts, parenting plan if you have minor children, and support like spousal maintenance and child support if applicable. That's attached to your petition packet and filed all at once. Once it's filed, it goes to a judge, sits on their desks for the 60 days, that's where the 60-day waiting period is, and then it is processed and signed. So depending on how quickly you get the documents into court, it can be that your process will take longer if you do summary consent decree versus the traditional process. The reason being, let's say you do your petition, let's say January 1st, then your acceptance of service or service process January 5th. So your 60 days from there is January to February to March 5th, give or take a day. If instead you decide that you want to go through the divorce process at the beginning of January in a summary consent decree process, you work through your agreements and maybe you finalize everything and get it drafted by January 20th. You file it, then you wait January to February to March 20th, give or take a day, for your 60-day waiting period to end. So there's the potential for your waiting period to be longer, but that's really only if you're in a non-adversarial process. If you were in an adversarial process like litigation, again, you're typically filing, but then your process is taking about a year. With that summary consent decree process, instead, it's going to be much shorter. Summary consent decree is only applicable if you're getting a divorce. So if you have a covenant marriage, which is a very rare type of marriage in Arizona, or if you want to go through a legal separation, which is an alternative to divorce in Arizona, a summary consent decree process is not applicable at this time, only for a divorce, or as we formally call it, a dissolution. Now, in terms of your process, the other big difference is filing fees. So for your standard divorce process, you're typically going to pay, at least right now with the filing fees as they are, about $200 more in filing fees than you will with the summary consent decree process. Because you're only doing one filing, there's going to be that savings that the court and the legislature has provided for. So in terms of my clients, I give them both options. I have some clients who want to do the traditional process. They want to get their petition and acceptance of service signed as soon as possible. They don't mind that they have higher filing fees. Others want to do the summary consent decree process. That's going to actually be most typical for my clients. They want to keep their costs low, and they are ultimately going to finish their agreements rather quickly, so it's not as though their timeline is going to be extended that much with the 60-day waiting period. But each client gets their own option. Summary consent decree process is going to be really helpful if you're in mediation or if you're using document preparation. So if you watch my videos, you know the difference, but if not, document preparation is you and your spouse know all the agreements you want to reach. You don't need any assistance reaching those agreements, but you want to make sure that they're drafted, filed properly. That's document preparation, which many of my clients do. The alternative is mediation, where you have a third-party neutral, a mediator like myself, helping you reach those agreements, draft them, and file them with court. You have to imagine doc drafting is not any hand-holding. Mediation, hand-holding. That's going to be the biggest difference. In either of those instances, summary consent decree is very common. If you instead go through litigation with attorneys, almost 100% of the time the filing is going to be a traditional divorce filing, because it's much more adversarial and because that's going to allow the attorneys to file a number of other documents like motions and orders that they need during their process. So that's going to be the biggest difference. You have your traditional divorce filing and you have your summary consent decree filing, which has just come about recently. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the comments below. You can always reach out with additional questions at couplesolutionscenter.com. But otherwise, I will look forward to seeing you next week when we go over our next big question on divorce and premarital mediation. Have a good week.